On a February morning in a Durham courtroom, a man who had spent years insisting he was innocent stood up and agreed to something that sounded like a contradiction. He entered what's called an Alford plea, meaning he could maintain his innocence while acknowledging prosecutors had enough evidence to convict him. And with that, the case that the world knows as the staircase seemed to end. But if you've ever followed this story, you already know the truth is more unsettling than a simple ending. Because that plea didn't answer the question people have been arguing about since 2001. It didn't tell us what happened in the quiet space between a late-night routine and a terrible discovery. It didn't settle whether the evidence was misread, whether the investigation got tunnel vision, or whether a jury saw something the public keeps trying to talk itself out of. A woman named Kathleen Peterson died in her own home. Her family lost her. Her children lost her. A community watched the legal system grind forward, then reverse, then bend into a shape that left almost everyone feeling unsatisfied. And for more than 2 decades, this case has been a mirror, reflecting what we think we know about marriage, about violence, about forensic science, and about how easily a story can harden into truth once a camera is rolling. Tonight, we're going to do something different than the documentaries and the debates. We're going to slow down. We're going to center Kathleen as a person, not a plot point. And then we're going to walk through what's confirmed, what was alleged, and what remains unknowable. By the end, you'll understand why the same set of facts can leave reasonable people on opposite sides, and why that tension may be the most important lesson of all. If you come here for deep, careful true crime reporting that respects the people at the center of the story, consider subscribing. This case has been told 100 ways, but the details you're about to hear, especially what happened after the original verdict, can completely change how you understand everything that came before. Before we ever step into that house in Durham, we have to meet Kathleen. In most versions of this story, Kathleen Peterson appears as a name on a timeline, a photo on a screen, a woman at the bottom of a staircase. But Kathleen lived a full life before she ever became the subject of a courtroom argument. Publicly available records and contemporary reporting described Kathleen as a professional, an executive at a major telecommunications company during a time when that industry was fast-moving and high-pressure. Work like that doesn't just demand intelligence, it demands stamina. It demands the ability to make decisions that affect other people's lives. And it often means carrying stress quietly, because you're expected to keep performing no matter what's happening at home. Friends and family described her as involved in the arts and community around her, the kind of person who shows up for events, who supports organizations, who seems to believe that building a life isn't just about making money, it's about making meaning. That detail matters because it tells us something about how she moved through the world, engaged, responsible, woven into the fabric of her community. Kathleen was also a mother, and the family structure in this case is one of the reasons the aftermath became so emotionally complicated. This wasn't a simple household with one set of kids and one set of loyalties. It was blended, layered, and by many accounts, close in the way blended families often have to fight to become. Michael Peterson, Kathleen's husband, had adult sons from a previous marriage. Kathleen had children from her life before Michael. And Michael had also helped raise 2 girls connected to an earlier tragedy, Margaret and Martha, the daughters of a family friend who died years earlier. By the time Kathleen and Michael were living together in Durham, the household was busy, complicated, and full of overlapping relationships. It's important to say this plainly. Regardless of what you believe about Michael Peterson's guilt or innocence, the people who loved Kathleen had their lives split into a before and after. And the pain of that split didn't land equally. Some family members supported Michael. Others didn't. Some changed their minds over time. Some carried their grief in public, in courtrooms, in interviews, on camera. Others pulled away into private life. When we talk about the staircase, we're not just talking about evidence. We're talking about a family forced to pick sides in the middle of the worst moment of their lives. Now let's go to Durham, North Carolina, to the Peterson home, and to the night when everything broke. It's late on December 9th, 2001, or more precisely, the early morning hours when most of the world is quiet and routine becomes a kind of background hum. The basic fact that begins this case is simple. Kathleen Peterson was found at the bottom of a staircase inside her home. The rest of the story is an argument about how she got there. Michael Peterson called 911. In that call, he reported that his wife had fallen down the stairs. Emergency responders arrived, and almost immediately, what they saw in that narrow space raised questions. Not questions that automatically meant murder, but questions that made it difficult to accept the scene as an ordinary accident and then move on. This is where the case starts to pull you in, because stairs are familiar. Falls happen, people get hurt, and yet, in certain cases, the context refuses to fit neatly. Investigators look for a coherent picture, a single story that explains the physical evidence, the timeline, and the human behavior surrounding it. In the Peterson case, that coherent picture never arrives without friction. Here's what is not in dispute. Kathleen Peterson died that night. Authorities treated her death as suspicious enough to investigate as a potential homicide. Michael Peterson, her husband, became the focus. The case went to trial. A jury found him guilty of murder in 2003. Years later, after major controversy involving forensic testimony, a judge granted him a new trial. And in 2017, the case ended with that Alford plea to voluntary manslaughter. That's the skeleton. Now we need to put the flesh back on, carefully, and without turning a real woman's death into a parlor game. In the early days after Kathleen's death, investigators had to reconstruct a private evening based on limited sources, statements, physical evidence, and later testimony. According to accounts presented in court and in public reporting, the night included time at home and at least some alcohol. The defense would later argue that a combination of factors, fatigue, alcohol, medication, could have contributed to an accidental fall. The prosecution, on the other hand, argued that the physical evidence didn't match a simple fall. They alleged that Kathleen was assaulted and that the staircase became a staging area, a place where the story of accident was created after the fact. If you've heard this case discussed before, you've probably heard a lot about blood evidence. Bloodstain pattern analysis became central at trial, with a state analyst testifying about what the stains implied. The prosecution used that to support the idea of repeated blows and a violent encounter. The defense challenged the interpretation and argued that the scene could be consistent with a fall combined with the type of head injuries that bleed heavily, without requiring an assault. This is one of those moments where true crime can become misleading if we're not careful, because it's tempting to think blood has only one meaning. But blood at a scene tells you something happened. It doesn't automatically tell you exactly what. Interpretation matters. Training matters. Bias matters. And this case would later become a national example of what happens when the credibility of an expert collapses. Before we get there, I want you to pause on Kathleen again. Not on the staircase, not on the debate, just on the human reality. Kathleen had a career that required her to be sharp and steady. She had children. She had relationships. People made plans around her presence. They imagined future holidays with her, future graduations, future normal days where she'd be texting about errands and complaining about work and laughing about something small and stupid, the way real life actually is. And then there was a moment in that house where she did not get to keep living. Her family did not get to keep having her. That's the center of this story, and it's the center we can't let the arguments pull us away from. Now, at this point in the story, I want to know where your mind goes. When you hear stairs and late night, and husband calls 911, what's your instinct? Accident or something else? Drop your first gut reaction in the comments. Not your final verdict, just your instinct right here, before the evidence starts pushing you around. Because the evidence will push you around. In the earliest phase of the investigation, one of the biggest factors was the nature of Kathleen's injuries as described in the autopsy and in testimony. The medical examiner concluded her death was a homicide. The defense disputed that conclusion and argued it could still be consistent with a fall. This is where language matters. Saying the medical examiner ruled homicide is not the same as saying, we know she was murdered. A ruling is an interpretation based on findings. It can be right, it can be wrong, it can be influenced by assumptions about a scene, and it can be challenged. But in a courtroom, that ruling carries weight. It becomes a cornerstone. Jurors hear homicide, and it tilts their understanding of everything else. If it's a homicide, then someone did it. If someone did it, who had access? Who had motive? Who benefits? Who lies well under pressure? And that brings the focus to Michael Peterson. Michael was not an unknown figure in Durham. He was a writer. He had opinions. He had a public persona. And prosecutors would later paint him in a very specific light. A man with secrets, a man with a temper, a man with a financial motive, a man who wanted control. The defense painted him differently. A man in shock, a man being railroaded by a system that decided what happened before it understood what happened, a man whose private life was being used to make him look like a monster. And the public, watching from the outside, did what we always do in cases like this. We chose which version felt more believable, sometimes based on evidence, sometimes based on personality, sometimes based on how we react to a 911 call, sometimes based on what we think a grieving person should sound like. The trial didn't just become a legal proceeding. It became a referendum on human behavior. In 2003, the case went to court. The prosecution's theory, as presented publicly, was that Kathleen was killed by her husband, and that the crime scene was staged to look like a fall. They argued that physical evidence supported an assault rather than an accident. They also introduced arguments about motive, including financial pressure and aspects of Michael's private life. One part of that motive argument involved Michael's sexuality and relationships outside the marriage. Prosecutors presented evidence they said showed Michael had been communicating with other men and possibly seeking sexual encounters. The prosecution suggested Kathleen discovered this and that it triggered violence. The defense argued that this line of attack was prejudicial and that private sexual behavior does not equal murder. Here's why this matters. In a perfect legal world, jurors would separate moral judgment from factual judgment. In the real world, character evidence can become a shortcut. If jurors decide they don't like a defendant, every ambiguous detail starts looking like proof. And if jurors identify with a defendant, even strong evidence can feel suspicious. The defense also argued that Kathleen had alcohol in her system and had taken medication, and that these factors could increase the chance of a fall. They argued that the staircase itself, with its shape and surfaces, could create a scenario where someone falls, tries to get up, falls again, and suffers multiple impacts without an attacker ever being present. If you're thinking, that sounds possible, you're not wrong. And if you're thinking, that sounds like a story built after the fact, you're also not wrong to wonder. This is why the case has survived for so long in the public imagination. Both sides can tell a story that feels plausible until you start measuring plausibility against specific facts. At trial, bloodstain pattern testimony became one of the prosecution's key tools. A state analyst testified about what the blood evidence meant. The prosecution used that testimony to argue the scene showed signs of an assault. The defense challenged both the conclusions and the qualifications behind them, presenting their own experts and interpretations. And this is where we need to step back and talk about what forensic science is supposed to do. Forensics is meant to be a bridge between the physical world and human questions. But some forensic disciplines are stronger than others. DNA analysis is powerful because it relies on measurable comparisons and statistical frameworks. Bloodstain pattern analysis, especially as it was practiced in past decades, has been criticized for relying heavily on interpretation, experience-based judgment, and sometimes overconfident conclusions. In other words, it can become storytelling with the authority of science. That doesn't mean it's useless. It means it's dangerous when treated as infallible. In 2003, jurors were asked to decide between two competing narratives, each supported by experts, each supported by selective emphasis. They were also asked to absorb the emotional weight of a grieving family and the spectacle of a media-heavy trial. After months in court, the jury found Michael Peterson guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. For Kathleen's loved ones, that verdict may have felt like justice, or like a beginning of closure, or like a hollow outcome that didn't bring her back. For those who believed Michael was innocent, it felt like a nightmare made official, a man going to prison for something they believed didn't happen. But the story didn't end with the verdict. In many ways, the story didn't even begin until after it. Because once someone is convicted, the legal system becomes less about persuasion and more about procedure. Appeals focus on whether errors occurred, whether constitutional rights were violated, whether evidence was improperly admitted, whether counsel was effective. It's not a retrial of the facts unless a court decides the integrity of the process is in question. For years, Michael Peterson's appeals did not free him. The conviction stood. Then a different case, separate from Kathleen Peterson, began to cast a shadow back onto the staircase. The name you need to know is Duane Deaver. Duane Deaver was a state analyst who testified in the Peterson trial. Years later, Deaver became associated with allegations of misconduct in other cases, including claims that he withheld results and overstated conclusions. Investigations and audits into the state lab's practices raised serious questions about the reliability of certain forensic testimony. And once those questions surfaced, they didn't stay contained to the cases where the misconduct was first alleged. They spread outward. Because if an expert misrepresented evidence in one case, what does that imply about every case where that expert took the stand? This is where the Peterson case becomes bigger than one family tragedy. It becomes about a system. In post-conviction proceedings, a judge ultimately found that Deaver had given testimony that was materially misleading and, in key ways, false. That finding mattered because the state's blood evidence had been used to support the prosecution's narrative. If the expert's credibility collapses, then the jury may have been persuaded by something that should not have been presented the way it was. So in 2011, a judge granted Michael Peterson a new trial. If you've never sat with what that means, take a second. A person has been convicted, sentenced to die in prison, and then a judge says the trial was contaminated enough that it must happen again. It doesn't mean the person is innocent. It doesn't mean the person is guilty. It means the process, our best attempt at truth, was compromised. Michael Peterson was released from prison under strict conditions, including house arrest and monitoring, while the state prepared for the possibility of trying the case again. And that's the moment when the public story gets even stranger, because the case had already become media. A documentary crew had been involved. Public opinion had been shaped by edited footage, by choices about what to include and what to omit, by the human tendency to connect more deeply with the person we hear speaking most often. In this case, the staircase became its own kind of evidence in the minds of viewers, evidence of demeanor, evidence of personality, evidence of what felt authentic. But no documentary can show you everything, and no documentary can remove its own influence. This brings us to one of the most controversial layers of the case, another staircase death years earlier in Germany. In 1985, a family friend named Elizabeth Ratliff was found dead at the bottom of a staircase. Michael Peterson and his then-wife were connected to her socially, and Peterson was reportedly among the last people to see her alive. Years later, after Kathleen died, the Ratliff case resurfaced. Authorities ordered an exhumation, and a second autopsy was performed. That second autopsy listed the death as a homicide. The prosecution introduced the Ratliff death at trial, not by charging Peterson with that crime, but by arguing it showed a disturbing pattern and provided a kind of template for staging a fall. The defense argued that bringing it in was unfair and prejudicial, and that the conclusions about Ratliff's death were contested. Here's why this part sticks to people's minds. Two women, found dead at the bottom of stairs, connected to the same man. It's the kind of coincidence that makes your brain snap to attention. Human beings are pattern-seeking machines. We are wired to see repetition as meaning. But repetition can mean many things. It can mean a pattern of behavior. It can mean a tragic coincidence. It can mean investigative tunnel vision, where a new case reshapes how we reinterpret an old one. And without a conviction in the Ratliff case, we have to be careful not to transform suspicion into certainty. Still, in court, the Ratliff evidence helped the prosecution tell a more compelling story. Not necessarily a more accurate story, a more compelling one. And compelling stories win trials more often than people want to admit. Now let's talk about the other theory that refuses to die, the one that sounds almost absurd until you look at why it exists, the owl theory. Years after the conviction, Michael Peterson's defense team advanced a scenario in which an owl attack outside the home could have caused injuries and disorientation, leading Kathleen to stumble inside and fall on the stairs. The idea gained attention because it offered an explanation that wasn't husband did it, or random fall. It was a third path, rare, strange, but not impossible. Critics of the theory argue it's a reach, an attempt to create reasonable doubt out of something sensational. Supporters argue it fits certain details and that people dismiss it because it sounds weird, not because it's scientifically impossible. If you're wondering how to evaluate something like that, here's a useful question. Does the theory reduce the number of assumptions you have to make, or increase them? Strong explanations make fewer leaps. Weak explanations stack leaps on top of each other. And in this case, every theory requires leaps. Accident requires you to believe that a fall, perhaps compounded by other factors, produced an injury pattern that the medical examiner interpreted as homicide, and that the blood evidence can be explained without an attack. Murder requires you to believe that Michael Peterson assaulted Kathleen, and then staged the scene convincingly enough to create decades of debate, while also withstanding years of scrutiny and appeals, and ultimately ending the case with a plea that still allowed him to maintain innocence. The owl theory requires you to accept a rare event, and then a chain of subsequent events that lead to the scene. So the question becomes, which leaps feel most reasonable, and why? This is where I want to ask you another question for the comments, because it's one of the few that gets to the heart of the case without turning it into a simple team sport. What matters more to you when you decide what happened? The medical examiner's conclusion, the blood evidence interpretation, Michael Peterson's behavior, or the coincidence of the earlier staircase death? Tell me which single factor weighs heaviest for you, and why. Because your answer reveals how you process uncertainty, and this case is built from uncertainty. Now, in the years between the new trial order and the final plea, the legal system moved slowly. Prosecutors had to decide whether to retry a complex case that had already consumed huge resources and had become a public spectacle. The defense had to decide whether to risk a new jury or seek an exit that didn't require admitting guilt. And Kathleen's family had to live inside that delay, which is its own kind of cruelty. Imagine being told the verdict you lived with for years is no longer secure, not because someone proved an alternate truth, but because the system's own witness may have been unreliable. For some people, that would feel like the ground cracking open again. In 2017, Michael Peterson's case reached its legal endpoint. He entered an Alford plea to voluntary manslaughter. He was released with time served. Prosecutors publicly maintained that he was guilty. So did the plea mean he killed Kathleen? Legally, it meant he was convicted of voluntary manslaughter. Practically, it meant the state avoided the risk and cost of a new trial. It meant Michael avoided the risk of being convicted again and dying in prison. It meant both sides stepped away from a courtroom fight that had already consumed 16 years. And it meant the public debate was guaranteed to continue, because an Alford plea feels like a non-answer to everyone. If you're finding this case as compelling as I did when I first researched it, I helps more people discover these stories. Now let me show you what happened next, because the plea might have ended the legal case, but it didn't end the consequences. After the plea, the Peterson family remained fractured in the way public tragedies often fracture families. Some of the children stayed supportive of Michael. Others did not. Kathleen's daughter, Caitlin, became one of the most visible family members to speak publicly about her belief that Michael was responsible. That division is a reminder that closure is not a legal outcome. It's a personal process, and it doesn't arrive on a court date. The house itself, the physical space that became a character in the story, also took on an eerie permanence in the public imagination. People wanted to see the staircase. They wanted to place themselves in that narrow space and ask, could this happen? Could someone do this? Could someone fall like this? The staircase became a symbol of doubt, of fear, of curiosity, of the human need to make chaos make sense. But no matter how many times people rewatch footage, no matter how many reenactments appear on television, the central reality stays unchanged. Kathleen Peterson died. She deserved to live. And the people who loved her are the ones who pay the most enduring price for the public's fascination. So let's revisit the key pillars of the case, slowly, and with the humility this story demands. Pillar 1 is the medical evidence. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide, describing injuries that, in their view, were inconsistent with a simple fall. The defense disputed that interpretation, arguing that falls can be complex, that scalp injuries can be dramatic, and that the pattern of injuries did not require an attacker. If you've never watched experts disagree, it can feel like one side must be lying. But disagreement isn't always dishonesty. Sometimes it's the product of different frameworks, different experiences, different priors. The risk is when certainty is presented where certainty doesn't exist. Pillar 2 is the blood evidence. At trial, bloodstain pattern analysis was used to support the prosecution's theory. Later, the credibility of the analyst who testified came under intense scrutiny, and a judge found that his testimony included false or misleading claims about his work and qualifications. That doesn't automatically erase all blood evidence, but it does change how much weight a jury should have been allowed to place on that testimony. Pillar 3 is motive. The prosecution argued that financial pressure and the risk of personal secrets being exposed could have created a trigger for violence. The defense argued that these were character attacks designed to distract from a lack of direct proof. Pillar 4 is behavior. People interpret Michael Peterson's demeanor through their own expectations of grief. Some hear the 911 call and feel it sounds staged. Others hear panic. Some watch his interviews and see manipulation. Others see a man being crushed by accusation. Behavior can be a clue, but it's also one of the most unreliable forms of evidence, because human beings do not grieve on cue. Pillar 5 is the Ratliff death. 2 staircase deaths connected to one man is a fact that is hard to shake. But what it means remains contested, and without a conviction, it stays in the realm of suspicion and inference rather than proof. If you're trying to decide what you believe, the honest answer is that you're being asked to take a position in a space where the final, private moment cannot be replayed. So what do we do with that? One thing we can do is look at what the case reveals about systems. The Peterson case became a landmark example of how forensic testimony can shape a jury, and how damaging it is when that testimony later proves unreliable. When a state expert exaggerates qualifications or misrepresents results, the harm isn't limited to one defendant or one victim. It damages public trust in the entire process. And for victims' families, it creates a painful paradox. They want justice. They want certainty. They want the system to function. But if the system is broken in ways that compromise convictions, then even a guilty verdict can feel fragile, and that fragility can reopen wounds years later. In some ways, that is the most tragic part of this story. Kathleen's death became a stage for debates about science, sexuality, media, and law, and the person at the center of it all, Kathleen, was often reduced to a silhouette. So let's bring her forward again. Kathleen was 48 years old. She had built a life that included work, family, and community. She was not a side character in someone else's drama. She was a whole human being whose absence created a crater. If you've ever lost someone suddenly, you know what that crater feels like. The world keeps moving. The news cycle turns. The documentaries get made. Strangers argue online. And meanwhile you're standing in a kitchen, looking at a mug they used, realizing you will never hear their voice again. That's the cost that never shows up in court exhibits. Now, before we close, I want to ask one final comment question, because I think it's the most important one. Not guilty or innocent. Not owl or no owl. But this, if you were on that jury, what kind of evidence would you need to feel morally certain enough to take someone's freedom for life? Is beyond a reasonable doubt a feeling or a checklist? I'd genuinely like to hear how you think about that standard. Because this case lives exactly in that gap between what feels likely and what can be proven. Here's what we can say with confidence about how the legal story ended. Michael Peterson did not die in prison for murder. The original conviction did not remain intact. A new trial was ordered because of serious problems with forensic testimony, and the case ultimately closed with a plea to voluntary manslaughter that allowed him to maintain innocence while accepting that prosecutors had sufficient evidence to convict. That ending is unsatisfying if you want a single clean truth. But it may be the most honest ending the system could produce in a case like this, where certainty is scarce, where the consequences are enormous, and where both sides carried risks they didn't want to take. If there's a lesson here, it's not that the world is unknowable. It's that we should be cautious about certainty when the evidence is interpreted through humans, because humans bring bias, pressure, and storytelling into every room they enter. And for Kathleen, the only lesson that matters is simpler. She deserved to live, and she deserved a world where truth and justice are not competing narratives. Kathleen Peterson was a mother, a professional, a community member, and a person with plans that never got to happen. Whatever you believe about the final minutes of her life, she should be remembered for more than the staircase. If this case stayed with you, consider sharing it with someone who cares about how investigations are conducted and how evidence is presented, because public attention is one of the few forces that can push systems to improve. And if you want more long-form, victim-centered deep dives like this, consider subscribing. I'll see you in the next one.